Hi friends, so building off of my video on how we should approach history and how we should and shouldn't do history and church history in particular, I want to talk a little bit about the priesthood and if there was a priesthood in the early church. That's a question that obviously comes up when you're comparing most Protestantism with Catholicism and Orthodoxy. If there was a priesthood, we should see some evidence of it. If there was no priesthood originally and that was a slow development, then we should see evidence of that, evidence of a change in how the leadership of the church was viewed and in how the Eucharist was viewed. Because obviously if there was a development from not seeing the Eucharist as a sacrifice to seeing the Eucharist as a sacrifice, that would almost certainly go along with the development of a priesthood. However, what we see in the early church does not support the view that the priesthood was a late or gradual development. It supports the view that there was a Christian priesthood from the very start, and that Christian priesthood is identifiable as the Melchizedek priesthood. And that part of that ability to identify a Christian priesthood is found in the fact that the Melchizedek priesthood always had an unbloody sacrifice of bread and wine. The Aaronic priesthood, which started later, always had bloody sacrifices. And just as Melchizedek brought forth bread and wine and was a priest of the Most High God, Jesus Christ is called by the author of the Hebrews a priest after the order of Melchizedek. And at the Last Supper, he offered an unbloody sacrifice of bread and wine. And the church has always offered that unbloody sacrifice of the Mass. Now, to begin with, let me clear something up. All Christians accept the priesthood of the believer. That is not a particularly Protestant doctrine. It is simply a Christian doctrine. All Christians believe we're all priests. We're all anointed. Like Zizioulas said, the term laity doesn't mean unordained. The lay are ordained through their baptism and through chrismation. So, we all agree on that. The question is, if there's a separate Melchizedek priesthood with Christ as the great high priest, and then bishops, and below them presbyters, as the priests who are offering up the sacrifice, Christian sacrifices. And there is evidence for this very early on. Now, first of all, I want to draw attention to the bread of the presence. The bread of the presence was considered in ancient Israel the face of God and the evidence of God's love. When Israelite males would go up to the temple 3 times every year, the priests would actually do something pretty shocking. They would take the bread of the presence out of the tabernacle or temple, lift it up in the air, lift up the whole table, I believe, and say, "Behold God's love for you." And while the Eucharist can certainly, and the Last Supper can certainly be connected to the Passover, it also is very clearly connected to the bread of the presence, which was pure unleavened bread and wine that was consecrated to God and was considered holy after that consecration. And not only did Christ set up for us this meal of the Eucharist with bread and wine, which he called his own body and blood, and St. Paul affirmed is, in fact, the very body and blood of Christ, so that when we eat of it, we have a true communication in the body and blood and can either have eternal life or be killed based on whether or not we are worthy to really be taking of his body and blood. That's a serious thing. Christ also gave his apostles authority on earth to forgive sins. And that verse bothered me for a while, and I asked one of my professors at Westminster Seminary, California, isn't that the establishment of a priesthood? How do we say that that isn't the establishment of a priesthood? And he said to me, well, we have a priesthood. But, if we actually called it that, everyone would, in our circles, would freak out. That's what he told me. Now, he to clarify, he wasn't saying that he thought pastors and elders were necessarily priests, but he was saying that the deacons were the New Testament priests. So not exactly what we're saying, but he was still saying, yeah, there's obviously some sort of authority on earth to forgive sins and some sort of priesthood above and beyond the priesthood of all believers. So that's very clearly in the New Testament. Then what else we see in the New Testament is in Romans 15, Paul calls himself one who is doing priestly ministry, working in the house of God, offering up the Gentiles as an acceptable sacrifice to God. And then the author to the Hebrews says that unlike the old covenant with the Aaronic priesthood, with many bloody sacrifices, we have a new covenant priesthood under our great high priest, Jesus Christ. This is a priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek, with one unbloody sacrifice. And the author of the Hebrews says in chapter 13 that we have an altar from which they have no right to eat who serve the earthly tabernacle from the Aaronic priesthood. So he's saying we have an altar and we eat the sacrificial meal on that altar. Well, what's that sacrifice? The author to the Hebrews already said that there was only one sacrifice of Christ, the bloody sacrifice of Christ. So what is this sacrifice on this altar that we are eating but the unbloody sacrifice of the Mass, which is a communication in the very body and blood of Christ that was shed for us on the cross, and therefore a communication in that bloody sacrifice on the cross that put an end to all blood sacrifices. Then in 9:23, Hebrews 9:23, the author says that we have sacrifices that cleanse the heavenly realities of the new covenant, as opposed to simply the earthly types and shadows of the old covenant. What are these sacrifices? And if you have sacrifices, what do you have to have? A priesthood. And from the very earliest times, from the first century, the church believed, and the very air that they breathed, so it was just the natural way that they were speaking, was that there were priests, there were sacrifices, and that this sacrifice was the Eucharist. Clement of Alexandria, who, as demonstrated by the Presbyterian minister Kenneth Gentry, wrote First Clement before 70 AD, probably around 68 to 69 AD, said that the Eucharist is an oblationary, unbloody sacrifice. I should say that he implied that it was an unbloody sacrifice. He didn't use the exact term unbloody sacrifice. That specific term first appears in Athenagoras, who lived circa 130 to circa 190 AD. He used that term. Ignatius of Antioch, who was ordained by the Apostle John, writing in the very early years of the 2nd century, said two very interesting things. He called the church a thusiasterion, a place of sacrifice. And furthermore, he said that we are to do nothing without the bishops, because they are the priests of God. Then Clement compared, in 1 Clement, compared the Jewish and Christian priesthoods. Let me read that for you real quick. He said, "They then who at the appointed time make their offerings are acceptable and blessed, for following the ordinances of the Lord they err not. For the high priest has been given his own services, and the priests have been assigned their own place, and the Levites their own ministrations. The layman is bound by the lay ordinances. Let each of you, brethren, in his own order give thanks to God with a good conscience, not exceeding the fixed rule of this ministration, and with reverence. So he assumed that there was a Christian priesthood with Levites, which the early church referred to deacons as Levites, and then he says, he contrasts this with the sacrifices that are still being offered in Jerusalem, which, by the way, demonstrates that he wrote it before the temple was destroyed. Then as we go on further, we have even more clear evidence. Tertullian, circa 155 to circa 220, says baptism is by the high priest. He is the one who has the highest authority to baptize. And if not him, then the presbyters or priests, and if not them, the deacons. If not them, in extraordinary circumstances, he says that lay people can baptize. Then Tertullian and Chrysostom both wrote, Tertullian a section, a chapter, and Chrysostom a whole book on the priesthood, describing the priesthood, describing its functions, etc. So they were clearly assuming that there was a Christian priesthood, that there was something from the very beginning. Irenaeus, circa 130 to circa 200, assumed the presence of priests with a general and a specific priesthood. So he spoke about the general priesthood of the believers and a specific priesthood above the priesthood of the believer, grounded in the priesthood of the believer, and that these priests serve God and altar. 2 generations from the apostles in terms of ordination. Hippolytus calls the bishop the high priest. There's a very interesting account, the account of the death of Saint Cyprian of Carthage. And when the bishop Cyprian died, before his martyrdom, he is described as wearing 3 articles of clothing and handing 2 of them to a deacon who is standing by. 2 of the articles are the mantle and the dalmatic. And a dalmatic is a clothing specifically worn by bishops, and I believe in some traditions it can be worn by deacons as well. There was a simple robe, which he was also wearing, which he kept on. And this simple robe was probably worn a lot back then, was nothing special, but today it's kind of special and might be worn by altar servers. In the Coptic church, it's called a tonia, but originally it was just a regular piece of clothing. Polycrates, the bishop of Ephesus, writing to his colleague Victor I, the bishop of Rome, in the last decade of the 2nd century, so that's sometime between 190 and 200, and I know that because those are the only years that they overlap in their bishoprics. He wrote, as part of his argument, so not like as an assertion in itself, but as evidence for the authenticity of the quarter-decuman date of Easter, he wrote that John, his predecessor at Ephesus, was a bishop wearing a golden mitre. So that demonstrates that by the end of the 2nd century, it was normal for priests to be wearing golden crowns, and it was well enough established and widely enough established that it was not questioned, and was even assumed that John was wearing a golden mitre. Now, he may not have been. This letter does not prove that John himself was wearing a golden mitre, but it proves that by the end of the 2nd century, bishops wore golden mitres. That was just the norm. This is clearly a very sacerdotal sort of development. And very interestingly, he calls the Apostle John Ierius, which is the undisputed term that it can be translated priest. So he clearly calls him a priest at the end of the 2nd century. Now, with the other term, presbyter, this could also mean priest. Presbyteros is a pretty broad word. And presvia is what's used to mean simply intercession in the Coptic and Greek liturgies. So presbyter does mean priest. Then some more evidence comes from the 4th century. So by the 4th century, what we see is Athanasius. He talks about the high priest, i.e. the bishop. He talks about the priests. He talks about the deacons, calling them Levites, just like Clement of Rome did in the 1st century. And then you have Cyril of Jerusalem and Ambrose of Milan. Both of those bishops wrote books on the sacraments. They're very interesting. I recommend that you get them. They're both very short and very eye-opening. And what we see there is that they definitely believed that there was a priesthood, a sacerdotal priesthood, that was tied to the administration of baptism and the Eucharist. So a little quotes from Ambrose of Milan's book on the sacraments. Consider where you promised, or to whom you promised. You saw a Levite, that's a deacon, but he is the minister of Christ. You have seen him ministering at the altar. This is just kind of the assumed, this is the way it is. He wasn't trying to mount a defense. Nobody ever felt a need to mount a defense. Nobody ever attacked the altar being there, calling deacons Levites, calling the bishop the high priest, referring to priests who are offering sacrifices. Nobody questioned it. When you drew near, you saw the font. You saw the priest above the font. For as soon as the priest enters, he makes an exorcism over the element of water. Afterwards, he offers an invocation and prayer that the font may be consecrated and the presence of the Holy Trinity come down upon it. So he speaks of the priest as saying a prayer that whereby the state of the water is changed so that it will cleanse us. Very similar language is used by Tertullian, by the way, who speaks of the water, the nature of the water being changed so that it can wash away sins. That's another discussion, though. And then he says, for after the font, it remains for the perfecting to take place when at the invocation of the priest, the Holy Spirit is bestowed. And then he talks about chrismation at the hands of the priest. So it was assumed by the 4th century, this is just how we do things. There's a priesthood, there are sacrifices, and in the original churches, in the first couple centuries, what you had was each church had a bishop, and he would be surrounded by the priests who were his assistants, and then the deacons who were assisting them. And very early on, by the 3rd century, there's also mention of subdeacons. And originally, the altar was in the middle of the church's meeting place. So you had the altar in the middle of the church, the priest offering, the bishop or president of the sacrifice, offering the sacrifice of the Eucharist and leading the congregation in worship, and the congregation really in offering up the sacrifice. This is all talked about by Justin Martyr. It's all described in detail, the 2nd century liturgy. The priests were then standing around him, the deacons around them, all assisting, and then the people standing in a wide circle around the center of the church, all standing, by the way, and offering up worship to God. This was how the early church worshipped. This was how the early church breathed. Then, between the 3rd century and going into the 4th century, because of persecution and bishops being in prison, and because of the church spreading out into the outlying villages away from the cities, bishops began more and more to give authority to the presbyters, or the priests, to offer up sacrifices, the sacrifice of the Eucharist, without the presence of the bishop, and to baptize without the presence of the bishop. But they were still tied to the bishop's authority. They still couldn't just be doing it on their own. They were still under the bishop's authority, and there was something, over the years, they began to leave something representing the presence and authority of the bishop in the altar of each local church. So those local churches, even though you might not have the bishop there all the time or even ever, would still have something connecting that Eucharistic sacrifice of the local church to the Eucharistic sacrifice of the bishop, so that really it's all one sacrifice in what we now call a diocese. So then we get to the 5th century. In the 5th century, the Apostolic Church broke apart. There was the Assyrian Church of the East, which we can debate another day whether they should really be considered an apostolic church, but the fact is they have a priesthood, they have bishops, they have subdeacons, they have the whole structure, and they broke away in 431 AD. Then 451 AD was the Chalcedonian non-Chalcedonian split at the Council of Chalcedon.